I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. And I want to welcome this episode Alissa Wilkinson. Alissa Wilkinson is a film critic at the New York Times. She was formerly correspondent and critic at Vox, and she is also the author of a book called Salty, Lessons on Eating, Drinking, and Living from Revolutionary Women. That was published back in 2022. This year, she's published a new book all about Joan Didion, but all about film criticism and all about the mystique of Hollywood, and a book that I think is really quite important. It is not, she says, a biography of Joan Didion, but in many ways, she gives us Joan Didion's life and she gives us Joan Didion's work. And let me give you the title. It's We Tell Ourselves Stories, Joan Didion, the American Dream Machine. And welcome, Alissa Wilkinson.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
And I'm pleased to have you here. Well, let's first talk about the Dream Machine, because she was a part of it, and she was central in many ways, a kind of Hollywood personality in her own way. You give us that sense, that visual sense of her with the stingray and the cigarette and
That's right.
Kind of things that she was associated with. But what you do in this book, let me just start out with this, is you put Jane in this sort of central role, casting role almost, of the American Dream and the filmic world that she created.
Yeah, it was an interesting project because, first of all, I've found when I talk to people about Joan Didion, a lot of people know that she was a writer. They've probably read The White Album or, Goodbye to All That, which is her essay about leaving New York City. But a lot of people are unaware of her Hollywood life. And for instance, I have recently said to people, she wrote The Star is Born with Barbra Streisand. And they said, what? No, I had no idea. So it was interesting to kind of delve into her life in Hollywood as a screenwriter with her husband, John Gregory Dunn, and the movies that they wrote together, the work they did there, but also their centrality to a moment in Hollywood life. But the book wound up going further than that because it occurred to me as I was reading her work and reading about her life and researching her more and more that Hollywood was sort of a governing metaphor or framework through which she saw a lot of other things that she wrote about as well. So I start with John Wayne and her interest in John Wayne and the way that John Wayne movies really informed her young life, and work my way through Hollywood. And then, by the 80s, she's become a political writer, mostly for the New York Review of Books. But if you read her political writing, she's often writing about how she sees the logic of Hollywood becoming the logic of American political culture and the dangers inherent in that. So there's a big arc to the book that is thinking about her life, but also Hollywood and American political culture all kind of on the same track.
And John Wayne is a central figure. I mean, she wrote that love song to John Wayne, and here was somebody named Marion Morrison, and a name that you don't associate with masculinity and the apotheosis of masculinity, but that's what he did represent. And he was someone who was very attractive to her in so many different ways. But there's that difference between the image that's created by Hollywood, which you capture in your book, and even Joan Didion, as a political writer, she's so associated with feminism and some, I suppose you could call now, neo-progressive politics, to give it a kind of phony name.
Right.
But she came from Sacramento, California, and she was a Goldwater girl, and she was really, in so many ways, quite conservative, even later on, more conservative.
I would say right up to the end. I mean, in the introduction to Political Fictions, which was a collection of her political writing published in, actually on September 11th, 2001, she says something about, I would have voted for Goldwater in every election since if he had run. So she actually became a Democrat, or at least left the Republican Party because of the California Republican Party's embrace of Nixon, and she just took it very personally, and she had no use for Ronald Reagan. But it's funny, when you read her writing on Reagan in particular, there isn't really criticism of his policies so much as his style and what he represented about American politics writ large. And that, I think, is really where the crux of the book lies, is in thinking about how she was kind of a media critic wherever she was writing about politics or culture or the arts or anything like that.
But that congruency, or that, shall we say, connectedness between Hollywood culture and political culture in America is really quite, to this day, remain, especially perhaps in some ways with Trump, because he's always thinking in terms of performance and how many people are going to be listening and watching him and so forth. I mean,
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, her objections to Reagan really came from his viewing, and, he would say this out loud, his viewing of the White House and politics sort of along the lines of a Hollywood production and a movie set and how movie sets were run. And that's because he, of course, came from Hollywood. He was an actor, as was, the whole apparatus. And in the case of Trump, Didion didn't write about him as a politician at all, but, he sort of revitalized his own image by getting into reality television. And you can see a pretty straight line, I think, drawn from reality TV that he, sort of became the businessman to a lot of Americans by playing one on television. And now the way the White House runs is very much along those reality TV lines.
it's also very tied in with at least trying to create a kind of cinematic reality, not only a TV reality, but a cinematic reality that goes back to, and for that matter, a lot of people may not know this, but recently Trump, who's putting his tentacles in just about everything in American life, Kennedy Center notwithstanding, has said that he wants to bring Hollywood back to its old, make America great again, and Bobby Kennedy Jr., make America healthy again. He wants to make the old Hollywood again. So who does he appoint? Mel Gibson, who I don't understand why he hasn't been canceled, but he hasn't. There's Mel Gibson and John Voight and another conservative, another political conservative. Who is it?
Yeah, there was another person, and I'm blanking on who it was, too.
But we all know what we're talking about here. We're talking about old-timers from Hollywood who supposedly, from Trump's perspective, are going to make Hollywood great the way it was. And the way Didion didn't necessarily see it in terms of that greatness. I'm thinking about her novel, Play It As It Lays, which presents a Hollywood that's really, people anesthetize themselves. Maria Wyeth drives freeways all day long. These are people who are high on something for the most part. They're swapping sexual partners all the time. It's a pretty grim picture.
It is. And her, it's funny to read her film criticism, which was really part of my discovery process in writing this book, because that criticism has not been republished in book form. So you have to go dig through the archives, basically, at the New York Public Library to read it. And
May I interrupt you in saying that's a fascinating part of your book, is all of her film criticism for Vogue and for, the number of it. Yeah.
So interesting. I mean, she, this was when she was pretty young. She was still living in New York. And that film criticism was mostly published in a column in Vogue for several years, which for a period of time she shared with Pauline Kael, who was not yet, the Pauline Kael who we know as one of the great American critics. But Didion's taste, at least in those years, is very populist. She wants movies that have like big sensational moments in them or big kind of sentimental emotions. And she doesn't have a lot of use for the kind of cinema that like a cinephile in the 60s would be watching in New York City. She doesn't like Shirley Clark. She's not interested in the French New Wave, none of those things. She's really interested in what we would think of as kind of old school Hollywood movies. But I think to her, the trouble came in when we blurred entertainment with reality. And that's what she saw happening over the process of the 20th century. And that frightens her, and I think a lot of us too. But at the same time, she lived in Hollywood. She was part of it. She knows all those people. They're her friends. There's great stories about their parties at their house. And all the movie stars would be there. Harrison Ford was her carpenter, right? So all of these are funny, interesting tidbits to the Didion story. And I think a lot of the process of writing the book was finding those points of tension and thinking about what they meant to her.
She also wasn't afraid of sentimentality, since you mentioned sentimentality. I remember interviewing David Foster Wallace, and he said, why do so many American intellectuals fear sentimentality? And Didion was not one to fear it. In fact, she embraced it.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, she also is worried when it shows up in our thinking about reality. So like Sentimental Journeys is the name of the essay about the Central Park Five. in that case. But really, she's thinking about sentimentality as a sort of a good thing that can be spun out of control when it's sort of dragged into arenas where it shouldn't be, such as thinking about crime, for instance.
And you mentioned Pauline Kael. She remained one of the idols for you as a film critic, as a film reviewer?
I mean, everyone who's a film critic has big feelings about Pauline Kael. And I think what I have always taken away from her is her just like insane passion for the form and how she can just lean into a movie and think and talk about it, no matter kind of how silly the movie might be, or maybe the movie doesn't, it's not like, there's no sense of like coolness to be taken from loving this movie. She just really goes in with her whole heart into the movies. And I teach writing also, and I often tell my students about the thing she said, which was someone asked her, why didn't you write a memoir? And she said, oh, I did. It's the reviews. And I think that's like a really fascinating way to think about writing as a critic. But her personal style and interest in the art form is so invigorating, I think, especially when I'm on my 300th movie of the year and I'm just like, it's fine.
One of the things I loved about your book is you give us certain films that really are marks for American culture, American civilization, and how things were moving at that time and so forth. Kael has been, and one of those films is Bonnie and Clyde. I mean,
yes.
In terms of fanaticism about violence and awareness, super awareness, hyper awareness about violence. Kael was accused of being too enamored of violence.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think it's a fair accusation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think she was enamored of aestheticized violence, which every critic is only working with whatever is in front of them at the moment, right? And we're like all products of our culture as much as anything. But Bonnie and Clyde also is a critique of aestheticized violence, and that's in there as well. One of the best books, honestly, on the air that's ever been published is Mark Harris's book, Pictures at a Revolution. And he spends a lot of time on Bonnie and Clyde and several other movies in that book. And I love the book and I love his writing, but I think he also does a good job of showing how it felt so bracing to be seeing that movie at that moment. I wasn't born yet when it came out, but even now watching it, I can see that. And you can feel that kind of invigorating sort of jolt that a movie like that would have brought to cinema at that moment.
Well, I know you have editors, but how do you decide what movie to go see or review for that matter?
Yeah, it's fun. So, we have a chief film critic and then there's me. So we're the two lead critics at the Times. And Manola Dargis is my colleague who's the chief film critic. And she and I both select some movies we want to write about pretty much every week. And then I also try to see movies that maybe I'm not reviewing, but I think are going to be something I might want to write about in another context or that might come up, later in the year. I write notebooks all the time. So a lot of it is just kind of having my ear to the ground. I try to see movies when they're on the festival circuit. I pay special attention to documentary. So I probably watch, 3 times as many movies as I write about in a year, which does come out to around 300, which is lower than some people. But for me personally, I'm trying to find that perfect mix of movies that I think people will want to hear me say something about and movies that I think I should say something about. Movies people don't know they're going to want to see or at least know about, but I think they should. And that often is how documentary works.
That's a delicate balance.
It is. It's tricky and it's all based on taste. And I'm sure I get it wrong all the time. But, to me, the job of a critic is to be able to unpack something for the reader in a way that helps them see it in a new way, which is very similar to what art does. And that is something that I can only do through my own set of eyes. So I'm looking for things that really I can sink my teeth into, which is what every writer wants to do anyhow. And of course, the great reality is that most movies are not masterpieces and most movies are not tragedies. Most of them are like fine. And those are the ones that are not much fun to write about. It's always great to write about a movie that's amazing or a movie that's terrible. But it's those ones in the middle and where you're trying to find something to say about a mediocre film. That's where the real work is. in film
Well,
criticism.
sometimes it's easier to say critical things, as critics are wont to do, and
Yes.
to say things that some people take for negativity and maybe a hyper-negativity.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And, to me, actually, I think Joan helped me learn this a little bit when I was reading her when I was much younger. But I think, there's always something you can say about a movie, but you kind of have to take it on its own terms and evaluate it according to what it is attempting to be. And I can't fault, a sort of a goofy rom-com for not having deep truths of the universe embedded in it. But if a movie presents itself as having deep truths of the universe, it better deliver. And if it doesn't, that's a problem for me.
When was the last film you saw that gave deep meaning to the universe?
Well, I can tell you I've been writing about Nickle Boys, which is, as of right now, up for Best Picture.
Colson Whitehead's novel.
Yes, so the movie based on it really is kind of a radical take on the novel, which is already pretty phenomenal. And that movie I just rewatched for a piece that I wrote that should be up soon. And that movie is pretty incredible and I think very profound. And that was a really... I mean, it's great to see a movie and then rewatch it 4 months later and realize it's actually better than you remembered it being.
I read some of the reviews. It's made in a revolutionary way to some degree, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. The director of that film's Ramel Ross, his previous film was Hale County This Evening, which is a documentary sort of. And it was nominated for Best Documentary when it came out, which is, I think he may be the only person to pull off that particular feat of his very next movie being nominated for Best Picture. But his interest is in breaking apart the way that we actually see people on screen, particularly Black Southerners. And he does it in ways that are just remarkable. I don't know anyone who's working like that today.
I'm sort of excited about Spielberg making a movie of James.
Yes.
Novel by Percival Everett, because I thought it was a fascinating and extraordinary novel. How he's going to do that remains to be seen, obviously. But there are those kind of filmmakers that you just naturally almost have to pay attention to. You're drawn to, but you have to pay attention to because of their names.
Yes, their names. And also, thankfully in the case of Spielberg, it's deserved. His remake of West Side Story, I feel like, kind of got slighted. It's major. It's a major movie musical, probably one of the best. And it's funny because this year is the 50th anniversary of Jaws. So I'm thinking about Spielberg a lot and about his legacy. And he really
You're right about Jaws. And you have some good things to say about Jaws.
Jaws is a great movie. And I saw it, on the big screen a couple years ago. They re-released it in theaters and just thought, man, this movie's amazing and also barely has a plot. How often does that really happen where one of the most beloved movies of all time also has a very thin plot and it's more about the spectacle?
But it's also, as you write in your book, about all these apocalyptic movies that were suddenly upon us. And then they kind of morphed into, at the shores of this big shark coming out of the water.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, right before that moment, it was all these disaster movies, and they're always about, talk about a plotless movie, right? It's basically like disaster happens, people try to get away from it. And usually the person who saves the day is kind of an ordinary, everyday someone in civil service or a policeman or like a retired military operative or something. And it's really about like the ability for ordinary people to save the world. And it's just funny that it gave way to the blockbuster, which got bigger and bigger and bigger until we got to the superhero era. And it's literally not ordinary people anymore.
But you're also, in your book, working with these notions of how Hollywood has affected our overall imaginations. And this can go not only in terms of American culture, but these films are global now. And in fact, a lot of these disaster kinds of episodes or car crashes, they play very well in different markets, and they're made for those markets. We could talk about that endlessly, but I'm just interested again in this notion of how the dream machine creates the way we think and begins to impose itself on our imaginations, on the trajectory of the way we see life unfolding and so on.
Right. Yeah, I was speaking with a friend the other day about this because we were, reflecting on world events in the U.S. and around the world. And we were thinking about how I think Marvel movies in particular, although it's not just Marvel movies, but that's a good shorthand, conditioned us to think that all villains have like kind of a point, right? That they have like kind of a reason they are the way they are, and that reason is motivated by being rejected or like witnessing a trauma or something like that. And it doesn't leave a ton of space for the fact that like sometimes people just do bad stuff because they want to and not because there's like some deep reason behind it. And, you know, the big bad villain in the Avengers Endgame movies, which are just enormous movies and loom very large, he kind of has a point. And that's sort of, you know, funny to watch in the movie. And I feel like maybe it's shaped our imagination to thinking about things like villainy and evil in ways that aren't actually helpful when we're trying to evaluate reality and realize that sometimes people don't do things because they're motivated by a desire to be accepted or something like that. Sometimes people just are greedy or they just are, you know, power hungry or something like that.
Or there's the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt wrote about. But I'm also struck by what you're saying here in another vein, and that is when we think about these type of films, Marvel films, as you put it, I think about the criticism that someone like Martin Scorsese has put out about Hollywood, saying they're making too many of these type of films. They're not making nuanced films about human drama and
That's
about
right.
the human situation.
Yeah. And I agree with Scorsese, which is not like a very revolutionary thing for a film critic in New York City to say. But I think, you know, his point is that these are thrill rides. They're constructed as thrill rides. They're not really there to like resonate with the human longings and desires of the audience or anything like that. And there's a space for those. It's really fun to go see a thrill ride movie. But what has happened over the past 20 years or so is that all of the resources have been kind of sucked up by the big movies, which are designed to open to $2 billion box offices, and left no space for what we used to get in, say, the 90s, where you had these you know, middle budget movies for adults about normal people having everyday things happen. Those are harder and harder to find, even in the independent world. And I do think maybe the pendulum is swinging back. There are some indicators that that's happening, but it's sort of funny that I'm not like a big fan of the Oscars, for instance. I don't love awards for movies. It just kind of runs against my grain. But I have come to realize that the Oscars tend to reward like the few middle budget movies for adults that are made per year. And for that, I grudgingly say, okay, we can keep them.
Yeah, but the Oscars are almost vilified by every major film critic that I know, and with good reason. I mean, the whole idea that you can select Best Actor when you have such versatility of acting
That's
performances, I mean, is absurd. It's ludicrous, really. So how do you get engaged by the Oscars? I mean, particularly since it's expected of someone like you to not only cover it, but to really give your opinions about it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the Oscars are interesting as a bellwether of how the industry wants to think about itself, I guess. And it's, you know, it's been interesting to watch it shift over the past 10 years or so, with the Academy very consciously expanding its membership so that it's no longer majority. I mean, the median voter for a long time was a 70-year-old white man living in Los Angeles. And they've certainly expanded. So there are people who work in the industry who aren't that person, and maybe they're not even American. So we get like a wider variety of tastes, and I think it's resulted in better Oscars over the past few years, more interesting winners and nominees. But honestly, where I personally get engaged with the Oscars is in the documentary and international feature categories, because I'm really interested in the kinds of movies that pop up in there and what they signify about what is interesting to the people who work in the industry. In both nonfiction and in global cinema. And sometimes the picks are crazy, honestly, or you don't know why a particular movie didn't show up. But they're always very revealing about trends and interests and the things that are occupying filmmakers who are a little bit outside of the main Hollywood machinery.
They've always been politicized, though, haven't they? I mean, or at least in the sense that political films and films that particularly represent victims and people who have different kinds of handicaps are given a lot more attention.
That's always been true. I think people forget this. Like, the Oscars were much more political in the 70s than they are now. And in fact, the Oscars were invented in order to bust unions way back in the day. It was explicitly a way to keep Hollywood workers from organizing. So there's a long political tradition in Hollywood. It's always extremely funny to me when people are like, why are they making it all political? Take the politics out. Like, that's been there from the beginning. You can't get away from it. But it is true that the voters often tend to go for what I would call issue films, whatever the issue is at the moment. But there is another side to that, which is that if pop culture is basically the cultural unconscious rising to the surface and it tells us what we're anxious about, then I think that kind of makes sense. Those issue films are the things that we're thinking about as a culture, one way or another.
I just thought of the third actor that has been appointed or anointed by President Trump. It was Sylvester Stallone.
Right, of course.
How soon we forget, Rocky.
Yes.
I'm getting some questions from our listeners. Let me go to some of them because this is right on point from Hannah Embrick in Boston. And thank you, Hannah, for the question. She wants to know, how do you define the role of a critic in today's media landscape where everyone has a platform to share their opinions?
Yeah, I love this question. And I talk about it all the time with my students in particular, because I love that, at least as a movie critic, for instance, I can go on Letterboxd, which is the social media outlet for tracking films, and find people who have fascinating opinions about movies and often are like very funny and good writers. So then the question is, what is my role as a professional critic? Which is a good one, a good question to ask. I think my role is to be a kind of a filter and a guide for the reader. And the function of criticism is to let you see what I see when I look at this movie, and then in so doing, give you space to form your own opinion. We find increasingly that readers are reading movie reviews at least after they see the movie because they want someone to help them process their feelings, their thoughts. They kind of want to bounce off of somebody. And I think a critic, I often compare what I do to like what a sommelier does, right? So my friend who's a sommelier knows everything about wine and can taste things in wine that I can't necessarily discern because I haven't had as many different kinds of wines thoughtfully as he has. And I'm hoping my job as a critic is not to say like, this is good or this is bad or you should see this or you shouldn't see this, but to sort of discern those flavors and tastes in the film and articulate them in a way that then you can make your own decisions about, what do you think? How do you feel about this? Do you like it? Is it for you?
It's a nice apt metaphor. However, sommeliers can also help you decide what you want to buy. And
that's true.
The old idea of the critic was, am I going to go see and buy a ticket, purchase a ticket to see this film based on what this critic is saying? That's part of your role too, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely is. And it is more my role now, I think, than it used to be since I joined The Times, because The Times is definitely one of the outlets that people look to kind of help them make that movie-going decision. But it's still true in the age of the internet that people are sometimes just popping over to Rotten Tomatoes and saying, oh, okay, that one has like a 60% rating. I'll go see it. And then afterwards they go read a review. So I've realized that I have to really write for both of those people. And that's a fun challenge, but I think a really good one. And it also means that sometimes I can write a piece that's designed to be read after you experience the work. So it has spoilers, for instance, or it puts it in a greater context that you'll understand after you see the movie. So I'm happy with either kind of reader, of course, but riding that line is definitely part of the job.
And here's a question from Bill Podesta in Denver, Colorado. Thank you for the question, Bill. He wants to know, how do you think the rise of streaming platforms has changed the way we engage with cinema and storytelling?
Oh, man. I mean, that
big question.
It's so good. Yeah, the shift has been pronounced. For instance, I mean, I know all these things about how Netflix, for instance, judges like if you've watched something, and it used to be that if you watched the first 3 minutes of something, they would count you as having watched it, which of course is ludicrous. If you walked into a movie theater for 3 minutes and then walked back out, you wouldn't say you watched that movie. But that's designs how they make their decisions about what they'll fund and what they'll create and what they'll make. And what will show up on your algorithm. I think one of the funniest ways you can see all of this happening is in the way documentaries work now. And a lot of people have noticed this trend but kind of didn't put words to it. So If you watch a documentary right now on a streaming platform, it almost inevitably starts with kind of a mini trailer for itself, right? There's like a little 3-minute thing right at the beginning where it sort of tells you what's going to happen in the documentary, and you hear people say things and you realize there's going to be some kind of a twist, and then the documentary actually starts. And that is a direct result of the streaming age. That is a thing that streamers want filmmakers to do because they know that they need to capture your attention and make you feel like you need to watch to the end of this. Whereas, if you watched it in a theater, for instance, like you paid for the ticket, you're going to sit there probably for the whole thing. So it really just changes the way that we attend to whatever we're watching. And also, there have been good things. I mean, when I was a kid or a teenager, I was the Blockbuster era, so we would have had to drive to the video store and take out a video and drive home and watch it and then bring it back. And now when I teach students, they often, they've got options. They can watch the Criterion channel. They can watch what's on Mubi. They can go over to Max. They have all these options to watch things as long as it's licensed by a streaming platform that didn't exist before. So that has changed the way that we cover things like independent art house and international cinema. And it's not all bad, for sure. But certainly tech has completely shifted Hollywood and the bigger movie business, which is what has always happened in the movie business.
And it has indeed. And you mentioned documentaries. I recently was doing some documentaries, some conversations on stage about some leading documentaries. And I think that you get a very different feeling when you have a live audience and you're in a theater.
Yes.
And it's like, I'm also a teacher like you of university students, and it's a very different feeling when I'm doing a class on Zoom than when I go into the classroom. It's
So
almost
true.
analogous in some ways,
Absolutely. Yeah. And it has a huge effect on how you watch, in particular, horror and comedy. Because having the human reactions to what's on screen really enhances your enjoyment of either of those genres, especially.
Another question from Flint, Michigan, from Susan Gathers. Thank you for the question, Susan. Is there a recent film or television series that you believe has been misunderstood by critics or audiences?
Ooh, gosh, so many. The thing that springs to mind is there's this very strange suggestion in the culture that if a movie is long, that's like a problem, that it needs to not be long. And I'm thinking specifically, this came up a lot with Scorsese's film, Killers of the Flower Moon, which was last year, I guess, last Oscars. So it's over a year and a half now. And it's been really interesting to me to think about this because in a lot of cases, it's a 3.5-hour movie almost. And I also talk to people routinely who watch, 4 hours of a television show at night and think nothing of it. And so I think this doesn't exactly answer the question, but I do think it's something critics think about a lot, which is that the difference between how we watch a movie and how we watch a TV show is kind of pointed up by this contrast. And that I think people don't want to challenge themselves with a 3.5-hour movie, whereas if they thought of the length of a TV show, they would realize it's not much different, right? But there is a kind of engrossedness in films that I think we lost when we shifted to watching lots of them on streaming and we always have our phones in front of us and it's second screen. I mean, a movie does demand your attention. A good movie does, in a way that a lot of other things don't. And I think people sometimes feel that and feel like it's the movie asking them for something they don't want to give it. But I also know the great, great joy of just losing yourself in a film. And I hope that we don't lose that as the world, spins on toward whatever it's going to look like.
As the world turns.
That's right. That's right.
When you mentioned Scorsese, I think of The Irishman, too, which was a long film. A lot of people were saying, well, you want to sit through that and you have to go to the bathroom, and what do you do? But I'm also mindful of the fact that people like Scorsese make films that they feel are more related to their interests on an intellectual or cultural level.
That's right.
After they've made the big pot boilers that make a lot of money. I mean, I remember Barry Levinson, who became a friend, and we used to have regular lunches, and he would talk about, now I can afford to make the film I want to make, as opposed to the film that's going to play for the masses and so forth. I mean, That's a constant struggle for even the biggest filmmakers.
It really is. And it's sort of the bargain you make when you go into filmmaking. I mean, I always feel like, it's the tension between art and commerce and it's most visible in cinema, I think, of the art forms. Certainly I've written a book and I hope people buy it and read it, but my writing of a book and distribution of a book is nothing like the battle that goes on when you are working in a collaborative medium like film. And what you just described, I know is something, for instance, that Richard Linklater has always done, where it's sort of a one for me, one for them model. And it's not bad for artists to do that. I think it's good to remember what an audience wants and also to be able to put your own distinct thumbprint on something.
Also, a division between the commercial as it's perceived and the artistic.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, the worst movies to me are the ones where you can tell that they tried to make it so appealing to everyone that they stripped all the personality out of it entirely. I would much rather watch an idiosyncratic movie that is not quite there, but that the director clearly was going for something than like a technically perfect movie that is just, it's nothing. It's just like eating vanilla ice cream, which is fine, but I would like to have some like sprinkles on it, maybe a few peanut butter cups embedded in it.
Well, some filmmakers make films, it seems, just to play with the technical side of things or to show their versatility in that realm. You mentioned long films. I haven't seen The Brutalist yet, but I've heard some good things about it, read some good things about it. But some people are saying it's long.
It is. I mean, they baked a intermission into it. So if you go see it, there's a 15-minute intermission baked right into the film, which I don't actually think is a concession to people's bladders. I think it is part of the form of the film, which has really modeled itself on kind of an old school epic. I thought a bit of Giant watching The Brutalist, actually. People were comparing it to The Godfather. There's some of that too. Yeah, it's a good film. It's not my favorite of the year by a long shot, but I think it's very much worth seeing. And I do think it's also worth saying it's basically a movie about the tug of war between commercialism and art. So it's exactly
just what we were talking about.
That's right.
Do you have a favorite for this year?
Nickle Boys was the top of my list this year, but I had right under it Eno, a few slots under Eno, the documentary about Brian Eno, which is actually makes use of a software, not AI, but a software program created by an artist that sort of generates a new version of it on the fly every time it plays. And everyone I show it to says, that sounds like a gimmick. And then when they watch it, they're like, this is one of the greatest films I've ever seen. So very highly recommend it. It will make you feel like you want to go out and create something.
Oh, that's quite an imprimatur. I was thinking about West Side Story you were talking about earlier and Spielberg's version of it, but also I saw Amelia Perez recently, and I thought, this is that old style, bringing in musical and wedding it together to essentially, in this case, kind of a thriller about cartel,
right?
And somebody who changes right in vogue with transgender stuff that's going on very much in our culture. I'm still trying to decide if I like that film.
I do not like that film, I should say, but it's been very interesting to see. I was at the press premiere at Cannes for it, and I just thought, wow, I have no idea how this is going to be received when it makes it out into the wider world. It made sense to me that it did well in France. It felt like a very French movie, even though it's in Spanish and set in Mexico. But it is France's entry to the Oscars and directed by a French director. But, it was funny also as a trend of movie musicals this year. There were a lot of them, some of which were kind of hid from the audience that they were musicals. But like the new Joker film was a musical. Nobody really saw that coming. And there's been other ones like that, too, that actually were popular and did well. Wicked,
well,
of course.
Look at what's on Broadway. It's all musicals almost.
That's right. That's all musicals, and a lot of them are based on movies at this point. So there's a lot of going back and forth between the forms.
And here's a question from Jeremy Pestillo in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Thank you for the question. How do you approach writing about film and culture for a broad audience while maintaining depth and nuance?
It is a great question. So obviously the Times audience is very large and very spread out, lots of different kinds of people from all over the world. So, you can get very up in your head about it. Like, how do I say something to everyone? And at some point I had to say, if someone's reading a movie review, it's because, or it should be because they want this particular critic's take on this movie. If you want to read somebody else, that's fine too. You know, the world is your oyster. There's so many critics you can read. So if you're reading me, you're going to get my take on it. And so I'm always looking for the thing that I feel like I uniquely can speak to, or uniquely meets with my interests. I don't have a background in film. I've never taken a film class. All my background is in, kind of philosophy and intellectual history and in nonfiction writing. So I'm often looking for things that kind of fit something I know about that I can write about. And that's what makes me unique as a critic. And that's every critic has something like that they can write about. So that's how I approach it. I can't be the voice of God, and I don't really need to be, but I should at least be my own voice in the critical world.
Well, you bring certainly some intellectual accoutrements to your work, which is valuable and certainly by my lights valued. I'm also struck by, as someone who's been dedicated to the written word most of my life, the difference with what you were talking about earlier. I mean, film is a collective project, and I find novelists that I've talked to who say, that's not what I wrote. It has nothing to do with what I wrote. It had to be turned into a cinematic experience. And so there's a real challenge there for any filmmaker, but it's also not only that challenge of turning, say, a script or a work into something that's visual largely, but also the collective effort that's behind it.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you have a massive team, even for a very small film. I mean, even Frederick Wiseman, the great documentarian, works with two other people. He pretty much is as close to one-person films as you can get, but he still needs collaborators. And of course, he has his subjects. Yeah, I mean, Nickle Boys is a great example of this, I think, because Colson Whitehead's novel is written in a kind of third-person omniscient perspective. And then the movie is mostly shot in first-person perspective. And it actually kind of shifts the gist of the story, even though the plot points are all there and it's quite a faithful adaptation. And I think those two together are so interesting because they're both great, but they both fit their story to their form. A book is a written medium and it's about words and the story that you're weaving in the words. A film is a visual medium. And so while the book is about how we remember the past, the movie is about how we see ourselves in the context of the past, and you're literally seeing it. So I just love that. I think that's so fantastic, and I'm always a little amazed when people are mad that a movie didn't stick exactly to the book, because in many ways, that's more exciting. Now you've got a second work of art based on the same thing. I think, speaking of Scorsese, the way he adapted Wolf of Wall Street, the way he adapted the memoir on which it's based, actually functions as criticism of its main character. And it's so sly and it's genius, I think. And I'm always really excited when I see an adaptation that does that.
Well, getting back to your book, we tell ourselves stories. I mean, that line of Joan Didion's has been adapted so many different ways. I mean, and given so many different interpretations and contexts and so forth, that you begin to wonder, what did she really mean by that? I think I have a certain fix on it, and you've helped me see it from a number of different lights. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So it's the first line from The White Album, which is the essay that her book, The White Album, is named for. And that essay is about Los Angeles in the late 60s. People usually remember the bit about the Manson murders, although there's more in that essay.
I love what Tarantino did with that, by the way.
Me too. Absolutely. Talk about adapting history and to say something new. But, it's interesting because she says we tell ourselves stories in order to live, which people sometimes think of as like an inspirational slogan about how we should write and how our stories are important. That is not what she's saying. She goes on from there to say we look for the sermon in the suicide. Basically we make up stories about the headlines we see to comfort ourselves, to tell ourselves, oh, this tragedy happened, and it happened for these reasons. And often it's so that we can go on living. So the randomness of the world doesn't keep us up at night, even though, of course, it probably does. And that question for her, what are the stories I'm telling myself, is sort of the eternal question that's present in all of her writing, right up to the end. It's very interesting that her famous late-in-life book, The Year of Magical Thinking, has that title. Because in a way, when she says we tell ourselves stories, she's saying we all indulge in magical thinking all of the time. It's the human impulse. So for her, the question is not, can we stop telling stories about the world, but rather, how do we continually re-examine the stories we are telling? And how do we hold them loosely enough that we're willing to alter them if we discover they're not true? And in 2003, she had that book, Where I Was From, which is about her re-examining the stories she absorbed and told herself about her home state of California, and about her place in it and her family's place in it. And it's a really fascinating book because it is actually a book of altering the stories that she tells herself, and also kind of a model for how we might do
I actually interviewed her on that. I interviewed her on a number of her books, but that one, the most recent one, and it was amazing to me because at that time Quintana Roo, her daughter had not died, but John Gregory Dunn had died, and that was what she wrote about. I remember the shoes and all of that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, just telling stories from that perspective of not wanting to give his shoes away, wanting to keep them because it's magical thinking.
Because he'll need them when he comes back.
He'll need them, right. But she was very aware at the time of the fact that, her husband had died, and yet she felt she had to move on. She had to do things, and she had to tell stories, really.
Yeah.
She was not a great interview. I mean, I was very fond of her, and I had immense respect for her, but she was one of these people who wrote exceptionally well but didn't talk so easily or fluidly, and that was always a challenge for me. She also wrote, talk about her writing for a minute, because I remember her saying to me that the King James Bible had so much influence on her style, just the cadence and the kind of fluidity, the poetry of the King James Bible.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And in The Year of Magical Thinking, she frequently quotes from the Book of Common Prayer, too, which she was raised Episcopal, even though she wasn't, or she would have said she wasn't religious. I mean, her writing is obviously everyone, even if you don't know what she wrote about, you know that her writing was incredible. And I think something that attracted me to her writing early on was she felt like a writer who wrote by ear. And at some point I read in an interview her saying she often kind of knew the rhythm of the lines before she knew what the words would be in them. It's like almost like a musician, And I, a couple years ago, went out to UC Berkeley and went through the archives there of hers. And there are a lot of beginnings of drafts of things, especially novels, in those archives. And you can kind of see her writing and rewriting a line till it sounds right. And that is also how I find myself writing, which just felt like validation, I guess, to me, that this is not an insane way to write something. But I think that was born out of her very strong belief that the way people said something was more revelatory in a lot of ways than whatever it was they said. That the cadence and the grammar and the syntax carried like a moral weight as much as the words themselves did. And that is not common among writers.
It's very rare, actually.
It's very rare. And when you've run into a writer who writes that way. But it also is a really good thing to foster, I think. When I teach writing, I still don't totally know how to teach that, but I think learning to listen to your own words is really important.
Well, there are writers who have to, read and hear what they write. And Didion certainly had an ear for dialogue. I mean, she had many gifts, but that was one of the many gifts that she had. She was also a writer who, as you point out in your book, saw things. I had a friend, Peter Weltner, I shouldn't speak of him in the past tense, a poet, who used to talk about her as the quivering sensibility, which is a little over the top, but he talked about Virginia Woolf the same way, so she was in good company.
Yeah.
But there was something about her view, especially as she got older, that was, as you point out, apocalyptic isn't too strong a word. I mean, and it was there in her prose. I'd like to get your comment on that. There's been made a lot has been made, of the fact that she saw a kid using LSD in San Francisco and said, "This is like gold," to a journalist. And many people saw that as heartless. Well, I thought Didion had a really bountiful, good heart. She was very decent woman in so many ways. Integrity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think she probably said it with a bit of she's always very self-aware, right? So she's very self-aware saying that this is not just a random comment. And what she means, I mean, somewhere else she says, a writer is always selling someone out. And what she means is something that I think both journalists and documentary filmmakers know, which is sometimes you just happen to capture something and you instantly know, like, this is the thing people are going to remember from this story. And it doesn't mean you're glad that it's happened, but it does mean that you, as a working whatever teller of stories, have sort of accidentally happened on the thing that you know is going to be gold. And I don't do a ton of that kind of writing, but even when I interview someone, sometimes they'll say something and you're like, that was it. And even if the thing they said was awful, it's like, that's the soundbite, right? And in this case, I think she was watching all of these things go down in San Francisco. And it's good to know the context in which she was writing this essay, which is that she had heard people act as if all of these quote unquote dropouts and young people were just silly, that they were just misguided or they were just, kids these days kind of sentiments. And she really believed there was something else going on there that would give the heartbeat of America, like, say, where the older people had gone AWOL on the younger generation. And that was what she was seeing when she was writing this piece. So for her, it's, people actually asked her, don't you think this movement is over? Don't you think this piece is going to be too late? And she was like, no, I don't think so. Not one bit. And she was right.
She sometimes felt, I think, the sense of prophecy about her work, didn't she? Or that she's certainly very prescient in many ways. But
yeah.
I was thinking about Slouching Toward Bethlehem, a great collection of essays. And as you point out, it's right out of Yeats. And that's a predictive poem.
It is.
It's a famous, and again, apocalyptic poem.
Yeah. Yeah. And you see it constantly throughout her work. You see places that I think it's because she was such a good observer of patterns and of the stories people were telling themselves, and was able to kind of notice what that would mean for the future. So when you read her political writing, it's astoundingly good. And a lot of it feels like she's writing about now, even though the people she's writing about are conducting their business many years ago. Of course, many of the players from 90s politics are still very much around today, but it's interesting to read all of that and know, the reason she seems prophetic is not because she has some kind of a handle, or a crystal ball. It's because she just deeply understood something about human nature from her years of very careful observation. And she was able to articulate it.
And sometimes could be very cynical about it.
Yes, very much. She's certainly not, I don't think she's hopeful, but she also sort of has faith in humans. It comes through in funny ways, but I think, like many people who write the sort of things she does, her faith is not so much in the systems, but in people's connections with one another, and that things like meaningful love and empathy and connection can still exist because she had them in her own life and she knew that.
And she also in her own life had some really very challenging physical problems. And
yes.
The result was she was somewhat neurasthenic, I think. She was constantly aware of a kind of pain, or also hyper aware of the possibility of danger and peril that was unforeseen, that could simply take over our lives.
That's right. And that goes all the way back to her obsession with the Donner Party as a child, which was one of the things she was so obsessed with, in part because her own great-great-great-grandmother, I don't know how many greats, but an ancestor of hers was supposed to be with the Donner Party and had kind of just peeled off ahead of that winter. So I think her knowledge that things could go very wrong at any time, started much earlier than things actually going wrong in her life.
Can you forgive me a moment of levity? I was reminded of a friend of mine who used to go into places and say, get the person to announce Donner Party of Five. He would just give the name as Donner and it would be in the restaurant.
That's great. That's brilliant. I wish I had that for myself.
There's great levity in that, yes.
Yeah.
So, here's Cynthia Libert from San Luis Obispo. You had mentioned her Episcopal background, and maybe Cynthia's after something along those lines, but she's asking, has your own personal perspective on faith influenced the way you see film?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was brought up in a very conservative Christian environment at a time when, movies were not something we were really supposed to engage with. And I certainly came from that. But I also, as a result, learned to read very closely. Read the Bible very closely, but also read books very closely. And I've always thought that learning to read closely that comes from that kind of an upbringing actually has helped me out a lot in how I view movies. And it also gave me a particular perspective on, I think, what art is for at its best, which is trying to tap into something that's human in us, that's, sort of inside of us. And that I think art is at its best when it helps us understand each other better. All of these are ideas that kind of developed in me afterwards, but I think that was a big thing for me, was to be able to come to that position and articulate it and know that some of the things that I care about in a film definitely come from sensitivities and interests that I developed, all the way back in my own childhood.
How'd you become a film reviewer?
By accident.
By the way, do you prefer film critic or film reviewer?
I mean, critic, I do more than reviews. So, I sort of do all of it. But I certainly do review films, but also write criticism, which is a bigger endeavor. I don't know. So I have a background in technology and computer science. That was what I studied in my undergraduate. But right after I moved to New York, which is 20 years ago now, I started dating my now husband, and he had gone to film school and was working in film. And I was living 2 blocks from Film Forum in the West Village. So if anyone's ever been there, it's like one of the great nonprofit art house cinemas. And I just started going to movies obsessively and realizing that there was actually a way to read movies closely and then to write about them. And I always had a knack as a writer. And then I just sort of did what a lot of people have always done, which is I just pitched things to magazines. It was an era of burgeoning online platforms that would publish you and sometimes even pay you. And so that's where I started. And you do it for long enough and hopefully people notice and you start doing it more and more. But along the way, I've had a whole, I worked for arts nonprofits. I worked at NYU. I was a college professor for 14 years full time before I had a staff job. And even now I still teach graduate students. So I don't know, I've never been only a film critic, but definitely becoming a film critic was a product of just being immersed in a culture that took film seriously and said there was something you could learn from thinking and writing about film. And that always appealed to me.
And now you're living in the literary ghetto of Brooklyn.
That's right. I've lived there for almost 20 years, but I don't live in the literary part. I live in the part east of Prospect Park. No, I mean, it's a wonderful place to live.
Well, Colson Whitehead's there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, all my neighbors. In fact, there was a point
Jennifer Egan, who we did a podcast with.
That's right. My neighborhood used to be full of film critics, a bunch of whom have moved out, but very prominent film critics. And I used to joke that if you dropped a bomb on my neighborhood, you would probably wipe out half the literary critical establishment in the world.
Well, I'm glad you're there, and I congratulate you on the book. The book is We Tell Ourselves Stories, Alissa Wilkinson, the author. I want to also thank all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't become a member of the podcast, I invite you to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes. That's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And my thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, and Colleen. And a special thanks again to our guest, Alissa Wilkinson. Thank you, Alissa.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.